All right, guys. Well, thanks, Jeff. Awesome. It's funny because I'm not a dynamics person at all, so being able to kind of get introduced to all of those concepts and see those things walked through, it's definitely helpful for me. So thank you. Very cool. All right, so guys, I'm so happy to be here talking about Azure today. So it's going to be Azure and Power Automate, a perfect match. So kind of, doing this whole mashup, Jeff did his, and now we're talking about Azure and Power Automate as well. So it's kind of nice to do these two where the services, they integrate. So today, that's what we're going to be talking about. Let me do a quick introduction to myself. For those of you who don't know me, Ashley Rogers. I work at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. I am the product owner for SharePoint and Business Process Management over there. It's kind of a new role for me in the last 3 months. I used to be a consultant. I used to work for Pate Group. So the transition between working in SharePoint every day and getting my hands dirty, being a developer, being a Power Automate developer, that's sort of changed now where I sort of have this like overview that I'm dealing with over at Takeda. So definitely new fun role for me, but I'm still doing SharePoint every day, still doing Power Automate every day, continuing to do speaking and blogging. So anytime you guys are interested, you might want to follow me on Twitter or go to my blog, spinbetween.blogspot.com. I talk about everything from SharePoint to Power Automate and even more. Talking about things like PowerShell or just things that I find interesting in development world and all that good stuff. I am a newly minted Microsoft MVP in business applications. So that's been really fun. This is my first user group session as an MVP, so very excited to be here. Yay! Yeah,
Awesome.
sweet. Okay, so a little bit of agenda for tonight. We're going to talk quickly about why to use Azure in some of your solutions when you have things like SharePoint request lists or you want to automate things with Power Automate. What does Azure Automation actually do for you and why do we care about it? So after we go through a little bit of theory, then we're going to go through the meat and potatoes of things here, which is the Azure Setup. So I'm actually going to walk you through how to get this set up. We'll talk about subscriptions, resource groups, and the automation account. And if you're not familiar with Azure at all, if it's sort of a scary thing because, like to stick in Office 365 SharePoint type of thing, don't worry, this is pretty high level. It's pretty easy to get stood up with, and I will provide the slides afterwards. So there's no need to furiously take notes or worry if it's a bit confusing because I will provide these after. So we'll go through the Azure setup, and then we'll also discuss adding your credentials, models, and modules, and then runbooks to your automation account. So it's really everything end to end that you need to get set up with. And then we'll go ahead and take a quick peek at Power Automate and look at the Azure actions that you need to use. All right. So why are we going to use an Azure Automation account? What does this actually do for us? Particularly if you're coming from the SharePoint and Power Automate world, what does this actually do? So if you're a SharePoint person, like I am, before there was Power Automate, there were SharePoint Designer workflows, and then there was also PowerShell. So I would often roll up PowerShell and start writing out scripts to automate some of the things that I was doing every day. So not only was I a developer, but I was also playing the role of an administrator. So anytime people needed to be bulk added to a site or I needed to do a whole bunch of different, all the different types of actions on a SharePoint list that I might have to. Maybe I'm updating certain values based on what the business is coming back with, or maybe I'm doing an audit of the information that's there, an audit of the permissions inside of SharePoint. I would open up PowerShell, write up a script, and then I'd run that on my local computer. But now what we're able to do is automate these tasks in the cloud using an Azure Automation account. So really what we're doing is taking stuff that you would have to write up and monitor running on your local machine and throwing up in the cloud and then putting a trigger and pointing at that from Power Automate and saying, hey, at this time, run this. Or when this trigger happens, such as a new item in SharePoint, go ahead and run this script. So it really takes that extra manual step out of doing a lot of the hardcore administrative tasks or even development tasks that you might have been doing before. So we also get to use a familiar tool. So Power Automate is definitely something that should be in your stack if it's not already, because one thing that we were talking about before Jeff started in with his presentation is just the simple little things that Power Automate can do for you, like throwing a task onto your to-do list. So anytime that you find yourself repeating tasks, Power Automate should definitely come in as part of the stack that you're using to make things easier. And then you can really enhance that by using an Azure Automation account on top of that.
And quick question, Ashley, that came in from Allison, which I think is great. Being an Azure and SharePoint person, do you know if you can use Azure to authenticate between SharePoint Online and an on-premises CRM implementation?
Ooh, so I'm not a CRM person at all. But if it's an on-premise situation, then I think what you're gonna need to do is you're gonna need to set up a gateway. And that's something that you can do, not part of anything we're touching here today, but I'm sure that either we can throw some resources in the chat or we can follow up after that.
I know Jamie's throwing something up there.
I
Jeff,
figured Jamie would.
Yeah,
Jamie, that's
Jeff,
how you're going to get your MVP, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah, he's working for it.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Cool, very good. So another thing about using the Azure Automation account is this really empowers your citizen developers and then the SharePoint admin and developers. In a situation where you have a large company, like for instance at Takeda Pharma where I'm working, there's a separation between the global tenant administrators and then the SharePoint administrators and developers. So you're not always going to have the same permissions. You're not always going to be God inside the tenant the way you might be if it's your own developer tenant or if you work in a small shop where you are IT, where you're everything. So if you have that separation between, global administrators and then, the people who are doing SharePoint development or Power Platform development, this in itself empowers you to do much more because you're no longer having to write PowerShell on your local machine. You're no longer having to ask for those permissions. You can get this set up and then you're off and running at that point. Cool. So when we're talking about end-to-end solutions, I like to slow this down a bit and say, really what we're doing is we're creating a process. We're connecting the dots between the disparate parts of an end-to-end solution and making it all sing with Azure. So I've talked about a couple of examples, but really, the thing that made me have to dig into Azure Automation as a solution and teach myself this was about a year, I'd say, yeah, about a year back, I had a client who needed to create a team based on an item inside a SharePoint list. So what they were doing was adding to a list all of the projects that they had going on. And for each of those projects, each of those items, they wanted to then create a team based off of the values that were in the project. So the name of the team would, come from the name of the project, and so on and so forth. They also wanted to provide things like administrators and things like that. And the reason that they needed an automated solution was these folks are not technical at all. They were using SharePoint because somebody else set it up for them, and it was kind of, the only tool they knew. But, talk to them about trying to create an actual team and going into the admin center to do certain things, it wasn't going to happen. So they came to us to discuss, well, how can we automate this so that anybody in the company can just add something in there, get a team, no problem. So this is really where Azure Automation came in, because what we did was we connected SharePoint, we connected Power Automate, and then we connected that to Teams. And there's an end-to-end process there all being glued together using an Azure Automation account and PowerShell. So talking a bit more about use cases for this, really digging into the why. So that first one there was that use case that I came up with, right? That end-to-end process of creating a team with an associated team site from a SharePoint request list. So you can insert here anything in SharePoint that you're trying to make a request against, any type of project, anytime you want to basically expand based on something that people are adding inside of SharePoint. You can also do things such as running site designs against specific sites, which, we can do that in the UI, but this is also anytime that you actually want to manage that, anytime that there's input parameters that you have to manage or something that you would rather yourself see happen inside of Power Automate to do more with, we can put this inside of Azure Automation. We can also do audits, on the sites that we have. So these are things like permissions and workflows and hub associations, things that the business wants to see in order to understand who has access to what information inside of things like SharePoint. There are tools out there that do permissions audits. But by and large, you have to pay for those. It's licensing. And if you're already licensed to use Office 365, you've got access to Power Automate. And it's as simple as elevating a Surface account to have a premium license, and then you're off and running at that point. And again, this really is about empowering the end users. When they can click a button and have something happen that they used to have to ask IT to provide, this is going to take the load off of IT to have to provide those things for them. It's also going to take out that manual step as well as make the process more efficient. So anytime that you can remove the burden off of yourself to continue to provide the same reports or the same information to the business, that's going to make them happy, because then they don't have to bother you. They can push a button, get the information sent to them in an email, and then you don't also have to babysit additional processes. So definitely empower the business and the end users. And finally, you are only limited by what you think you can accomplish with a PowerShell script. So if you're familiar with PowerShell, if it's something you've been using to manage your day-to-day, then really throw it in Azure Automation, see what you can do to make things a lot easier for yourself. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the Azure setup, the step-by-step that we're going to have to go through here. So at a high level, the nuts and bolts here we're going to be setting up an Azure subscription. We're going to be setting up a resource group, and then we'll set up an Azure Automation account. Inside that account, we're going to talk about credentials, modules, and runbooks. And once we have all of those pieces put together, then you're ready to go and you can connect things up to Power Automate. So Jeff had screenshots. I do have screenshots, but I also pray to the demo gods, and we hope that they are with me today so I can do this live. But if I can't, then for sure I will provide these to you at the end. All right, so everybody should be seeing my dashboard in Azure at the moment. So when you come into Azure, it's portal.azure.com, and this is where you're going to start from. So the first thing you need to do is get yourself familiar with portal.azure.com, with the actual dashboards and everything that's on the left rail here. There's a lot more here than I use, even in a month. I'm typically in here to set up automation accounts, or to do things like unblock people when they need to own a certain Azure function and things like that. And so, by and large, there's a lot more in here than I deal with on a day-to-day basis. But it's worth coming in, seeing what's on the dashboard, seeing what's on your left rail, and then editing your dashboard to add pieces here that you use frequently. So I've pulled in my resource groups, I've pulled in the service health, and then also all resources, and the marketplace, because that's fun. But basically, this is going to be your one-stop shop, and it's a lot easier to customize your dashboard to get to what you need to use daily than it is to try to sort through things here. You can also go to the search bar and then search for things just by name. So you can see that there's recent services that I've searched for, but if I simply type in subscriptions, it's going to start doing this type ahead where it thinks that I want subscriptions, and there it is. So that's actually where we're going to start, is to look into subscriptions. If you don't have one set up already, if your company doesn't already have a subscription ready for you to use, I use the pay as you go, and you can go ahead and add that very easily yourself. There's a wizard that walks you through setting it up, and you do have to provide a credit card, but I have never ever been billed for anything that I use as far as just setting up demo as far as doing the Azure Automation account, everything is super, super cheap inside of Azure. The places that this will be, a big gotcha where the money actually is when you're running VMs and things like that. So just be careful what you add to the subscription. Make sure that you're checking with the right global admins as you do this. But if you're doing this for yourself and you're doing it in a dev tenant, super easy to get ready to get going with the pay as you go subscription. So I already have one set up, and that's the one that we're going to use. And I'm going to go back to the dashboard. Now, the next thing to do is to set up a resource group. Everything starts with a resource group, and you can see that it's over here on the left rail, but I also have my resource groups here on the dashboard. It's nice and easy for me to get to. So I have one set up, PowerShell Azure Resources, but we'll go to resource groups and just kind of walk through how to add one. So if I'm going to go ahead and click add, there we go. And it's going to give me the create a resource group walkthrough here. So we're just going to pick the subscription that we have already. So it's my pay as you go. If you have multiple ones, you just use the drop down and then find yours. And then you're going to go ahead and pick the region. So this is important because this is where your resources are actually located. So for me, it's East Coast US. So I use East US. And then I'm going to just simply click on review and create. So I didn't provide all of my information here, so obviously it's going to fail. But what's going to happen here is it's going to allow you to just double check everything, and then you'll click on create, and then you're going to get a little notification up here at the top. So anytime you create something inside of Azure, it's going to be here in your notifications, and you'll have all the activity that's happening here. So the majority of things that you create will happen very, very quickly, but if things need to propagate, if there's permissions that you're adding and things like that, it may take a few minutes. All of that's going to be under notifications. So if you're waiting on something and you missed the little pop-up that happens, just come here to the little bell, it'll all be there. So let's go back to the dashboard and we'll hit PowerShell Azure Resources, which is my resource group. And again, if this is new to you, if you haven't been inside here before, this can be really confusing. There's a lot going on here. We have additional information such as the subscription ID and the subscription name, all the things that are related to that resource group. We also have all of the different run books and accounts and things like that, everything that I've created, and it's all here ready for you to go. But if you are using a brand new resource group, you're not going to really have too much here, and you're going to instead need to look down here to find everything that you need. But so we've got our resource group created. And then I'm going to do the next piece here, which is to actually create the automation account. It's related right now, the one I have, it's related to this resource group. So it's showing up here in my dashboard inside the group. But if it's the first time you're doing it, you're going to come here to the search bar and you're going to type in automation. And it'll pop up first with automation accounts. So you can see what we're doing is creating the different pieces and then just associating them with each other. So it's a bit, again, if it's the first time you've done it, it's a little hard to kind of say, okay, well, I jump here and create a subscription, and I jump here and create a resource group, and then I jump here and make an automation account. But all of it will tie together and it'll all be easy to get to once you've set it up. So we'll click on automation accounts. And I only have one, so we can take a peek at this in a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and click on add. And what you're going to do is name the automation account. You can name it something that makes sense for what you're doing with it. That always works for me as far as keeping a naming convention. If it's an automation account you're going to use in multiple places, then you want to name it something that makes sense. But pick a naming convention that works for you. PowerShell automation account or SharePoint automation account or whatever it is that works for you. You'll pick the subscription that it's related to, and then you'll also pick the resource that it's related to. You'll pick the location, stick with the same location that you chose for your resource group. And then you definitely need to say create Azure Run as account. So if you say no, it's not going to do anything for you. So I have not yet divined the purpose of why you would say no. Somebody here who's more familiar with Azure might be able to tell me in what case I would want it to be not a run as account, but you definitely want to have this toggle as yes in this instance. And then you go ahead and click on create. When you create it, we're going to go ahead and look at mine. When you create the automation account, you're going to get a lot of pieces inside here, very similar to looking at the resource group. We've got lots of stuff going on in here. We've got lots of configuration, we have process automation pieces, and that's really the part that we care about. So notice that when we created the subscription, the resource group, and then this account, we've connected all the pieces up together, and they can all be viewed from within each other. But for the real, the real nuts and bolts, what we're actually going to be doing and what you need to run your PowerShell, that's actually all happening inside the automation account itself. So these are the credentials that you're going to use, the modules that you're going to add to the account, and then the runbooks that you're going to create. Those runbooks are what actually holds the PowerShell. So all of those pieces, the real meat of everything, is actually happening inside the automation account itself. Okay, so at this point, any questions before we actually go ahead and add all of that together?
Not seeing too many new questions.
Cool.
Jimmy did throw in the whole Azure Microsoft Learn path, which is a great introduction, by the way.
That's fantastic. Good stuff. Jamie's always good with the links.
Yes,
Awesome.
combine it all.
There you go. All right, so let's jump in and add our credentials. So as I said, all of that is located here inside the automation account itself. And you can go ahead and search here, but you can also scroll through and look what's available. And we're going to click on credentials. And I have credentials loaded in here already. This is one of my tenant admin accounts. And when you're adding a credential in here, what you want to do is make sure you're actually using a login that already has access or that will have access to the resources that you need when you're actually running your PowerShell. So for those folks who are SharePoint people and who have been using the SharePoint management shell on their local machine to do this. These are the credentials or the admin accounts that you would have used to run PowerShell against SharePoint already. So when you think about this, maybe that's your account if you're the right person, or maybe you actually need to get another tenant admin involved in creating this for you or creating a service account for you. So it really depends on your situation, but you want to think ahead before you add credentials, because if you add the wrong ones or you add the ones that don't have the right access, your runbooks are going to fail. And when you're actually looking at Power Automate and you're watching the fails come through on Power Automate, it's really not obvious that from that point when you're debugging what's wrong with the credentials. So you want to come back and make sure that you actually have access to what you need. So if that means that you need to be a Teams administrator, make sure that happens. If you need to be a SharePoint administrator, make sure that happens. So you want to go ahead and name this something that works for you. So for me, it's Arts Admin because Arts is the tenant that I have, and so it's an admin account. So you want to name that something, but that's not necessarily the username. You're going to put in the username and the password for the credentials and provide a description if you want to, but you want to take note of the credential name itself for later. Okay. So once you've added in credentials and you're all good to go with that, you're going to go ahead and take a look at your modules. So when you have all the modules loaded that you need, you can search in here and see if everything's there. So we're going to type in SharePoint in the search bar. Search is amazing inside of Azure. And we can see that the Microsoft Online SharePoint PowerShell module is already loaded. So that's something that I've added in here. But if you want to make sure that Teams is in there, we've got our Microsoft Teams in there. So you want to make sure that everything's in there as needed. And if you need to add something, go ahead and add the module that you need. And you can go ahead and search for it. There's a lot in here, more than I've ever used myself. But for me, it's always Teams or SharePoint that's needed. So once you've loaded in your modules, then we can go ahead and create a runbook. And that's really where I find it to be the real fun part here. So under Process Automation, we're going to click on Runbooks. And then this is where I have a few runbooks that I've been working on. But to create one, you just click on Create a Runbook. And then you're going to type in a name. So I'll just call this Portland User Group Runbook. And then you'll pick a type. So for me, it's always PowerShell. So I don't do Python or anything else like that. So I always do PowerShell. And then you go ahead and create it. And you can see that we've got our little notification. Like I mentioned before, as you create things, it's always showing up in your little notifications here. So while we're inside the runbook, this looks like any other lightweight IDE that you might have run into. So then for the non-developer folks, that's an integrated development environment, an IDE. So anytime you're working inside of something like Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, this is really just sort of a lightweight way to put your code in and then be able to see all the different parts of what's actually in there. So you're going to put in your variables and things like that. This is not as powerful as even Visual Studio Code. So if you want full IntelliSense and things like that, go ahead and write your PowerShell elsewhere. If you already have scripts that you have, you can copy and paste them in here and clean them up. But really, this is where you're putting all of that PowerShell so that this can actually execute. So this is going to save it here, and you're going to be able to run it from here and test it from here. But you can also call this from Power Automate, which we will look at in a few minutes. So I'm going to show you one that I've already put together, which is super fast and easy. I'm going to go to my Get SPO Hub Sites runbook. And then I'm just going to click on Edit to show you guys what's going on in here. Okay, so couple of important pieces. So we need to do a few things inside the script itself that we might not necessarily do if you were running PowerShell manually and watching it happen from your local machine. So, when you connect up to, you run Connect SPO service and you're actually connecting to SharePoint Online, when you do that, maybe you're typing that in and you're then providing the login information at that moment. But since we want to automate this, we don't want anybody to have to babysit and put in the credentials. So what we're doing is providing the login by using get automation PS credential. And the name of that is what I told you to note down before, which is the name of the automation account credentials, but not the username of the account. That itself can be kind of a gotcha when you're providing the name for this. You might think username first, but this is actually just the name of the credential account itself. This is not the Azure Automation account. It is not the username, but it's the name of the credentials as you named them in Azure. So for me, it's arts admin, goes inside of quotes, and all that's captured inside of login. So then we provide the URL that we're logging into, which is going to be, the admin.sharepoint.com URL, just as normal when you're connecting up to SPO service. And then you're going to provide the credential login. And this is going to log it in for you so that you don't even have to do, don't have to do anything for it here. So I'm also just doing a quick output here of get SPO hub site because for our purposes, I'm just trying to prove that I can get some information back from SharePoint using Azure Automation, PowerShell, and Power Automate. So I'm simply holding the output of get SPO hub site, which will show me all of the hub sites that are inside of my tenant. I'm going to write this output as JSON. So That's also important because if I'm going to be capturing this information and doing something with it with Power Automate, then what I want to do is I want to bring it in such a way that Power Automate can understand it. And one of the easiest ways to consume information and actually do something with that is to parse out JSON inside of Power Automate. So again, I will show you that, but what we want to do is make sure that this is providing something that I can do, that I can actually make use of. And then super important to do is once you've written that output, we want to disconnect from the service. We don't want to keep this open. We don't keep it running. So we just want to make sure that we just disconnect. No need to provide anything else other than disconnect at that point. So questions? Any questions here?
Not seeing anything just yet.
Cool.
Is this script available somewhere, or did you write this yourself?
Yeah, so I wrote this myself because it's just, simple, whatever we want to do, we could put anything inside that output, but I would be happy to provide this for you guys. So I can provide this maybe in the slides when I post them.
That'd be awesome.
Cool.
Sure, let me take a note on that. It's really the pattern that I follow anytime I do a runbook like this, anytime I'm working with SharePoint. All right, cool. All right, so let's take a look at Power Automate now, because this is something I've tested before. We could test this here. We've got a test pane. If I wanted to run this, I can go ahead and start this. So let's do it because we have a little bit of time. So all I did was hit the test pane and then I started this, and it's going to queue it up. And the reason it queues up the resources is because if you've got other things running inside of Azure, and I'm assuming you will once if you're in a large corporation or other people are hitting Azure, it just basically takes a place in line and it lets you know when it's done. And you can see that this is the output that is in JSON format. And it's showing me that I have two different hub sites. You can see because there's two different ones here that I have two different hub sites. And this is the content that's going to be provided back to me inside of Power Automate when I hit this with my Azure actions. So we've tested it, we know it works, and we're good to go. So now we can move on to Power Automate. Okay. So again, if you're not familiar with Power Automate, I definitely, would love you guys to make that part of your stack, go in and play with it. It's super, super easy to get, spun up with. And all you have to do is go to My Flows and create a new one. So for my purposes here, whenever I'm doing testing and development or any type of session such as this, I end up creating a manually triggered flow, just because it's much easier as we're doing this. So it's just easier to run it as every time that I want to test something rather than waiting for a schedule or waiting for another trigger, unless that's the thing I'm testing. But I always do a manually triggered flow. So what we want to do is take a look at the actions that are available as part of Azure Automation. So I've got them set up. I have this flow set up, but let's do a quick new step here at the bottom just to take a look at what's available from Azure. So I just hit the little plus sign to create a new action, and then I'm going to type in Azure. And what we're looking at here is Azure Automation. Don't be confused by all the other Azure connectors that are here. We want the Azure Automation piece. And you can tell that it's the same simply because it's got that little gear and lightning bolt. And that's actually the same little icon that's being used in the Azure Automation account when we created that. So they're keeping the branding pretty similar so that you can look at it and know what that is. So I'm going to click on Azure Automation. And the first thing you're going to notice is that these are all premium actions. And that's really, really important to know. So you can get a premium license for a service account if that's the way that you need to set this up. I do suggest that you use service accounts in general when you're actually doing this in production, because we don't want actual day-to-day production level flows to be running under anybody's username. If it's for yourself, if it's something that you're doing and it doesn't matter if you leave the company and then that flow never runs again, then that's fine. But if you're doing something for people providing reports, providing audits and things like that, you definitely want to set up a service account. So make note that it's premium. Didn't used to be. but it is now. So we have our three here, our three actions: create a job, get job output, and then get status of a job. I'll show you how to use those at the top there. Okay. So we're using the create job action here, and I've renamed it to make sense to me. So create job, get SPO hub sites, because I know that I'm using the get SPO hub sites runbook that I've just created. And I just want to make sure that at a glance, I can see what's happening. If somebody else has to maintain this, this is going to be a lot easier for them to read if you rename your steps properly. So we're going to select the subscription. We're going to select the resource group, the automation account, and also the runbook name. So all of this is pulling from the connection I've made to Azure. So I've logged in as myself here. I have access over there to all of these. You're only going to see the subscriptions, groups, and accounts that you have access to. So, you know, if you want to keep these separate, if you know, somebody else is working on something, they're not going to be able to grab yours. So that's really important. It's really just authenticating with that connection here. So based on that, I'm going to be able to see all the runbooks that I have available and choose those as well. If I had provided, if I needed to provide parameters, that's actually going to pull those, you know, those places for variables and the names that I give the variables. It's actually going to automatically pull that into the create job here, which is very cool and very handy. So if you needed to provide input, say from a SharePoint list, and then use that input inside your PowerShell, it's going to be very easy for you to potentially grab a SharePoint list using an action here, pull dynamic content in, and then put that into the parameters that the job actually takes. So you can see that as you're starting to think about how things are going to get connected and how you'd use this in a larger process, it's actually pretty easy to get, you know, to get going, and they've thought about a lot of it, made it very easy for you. So I always say wait for job because I'm usually doing something else with this. I need the information. It's not something that's running by itself, you know, off in the distance and doesn't matter. If you do have that, you don't necessarily have to wait for the job to complete. But for me, I'm typically waiting for the job to complete before I move on to the next action because I need something coming back from that job. And in this instance, it's that I need to get the output of the job. So when we create the job, we're running the PowerShell in the cloud, and then something's coming back from that. But it's the output that you need to get, and that's where the get job output action comes in. And we're again providing subscription, resource group, and automation account in here inside the job output. But the important piece is to pull the job ID that is coming from the create job here. So if we hover over this, we can see that this is coming from above, from the create job, get SPO hub sites action, and then it's bringing back the job ID. So this is what's telling it, you know, this is what I want. I want the output from this particular run. And then what we're doing is providing the content that, see if I hover over this, the content that's coming from the get job output action, we're providing that to a parsejson action. So quick pause here for those folks who are not familiar with a parsejson action. I never like to assume that you are because it could be something that you haven't used before. Even if you're familiar with Power Automate, maybe it's not something that you've needed to do before. I want to pause here and say that to provide the schema in the parsejson action, you actually need to run the job and the job output before you then add the parsejson action. So what ends up happening is you're going to run this basically as a test with some test information. And then when you get a successful run, like this one, we're going to come here to this successful run. If you open up the get job output action as it's succeeded, you'll see the content here is exactly the same JSON that I have here in my test. So it's the information that comes back from the job. It's a successful run. And then this, you're going to copy out, just do a quick Control C. And then you're going to edit your flow again. And inside a parsejson action, you'll click on Generate from Sample, and then you're going to insert that payload. You're just going to do a Control V. So you're copying out the content and you're pasting it here as a sample payload. And then from there, this is going to automatically create the schema for you that makes sense. So just making sure everybody knows here that, you know, before you proceed, you actually do need to get a successful run. You need to provide that schema to the parsejson action, and then you can add the content, the dynamic content here into the parsejson action. Are there any questions at that point? Because that can get a little confusing if you've never seen it before. Thinking we're good?
Yeah, I think we're good. I'll let
Sweet.
you know if some come up. Thank
Cool. All right, so once we run that parsejson action, then what we're going to do is do something with that content that comes back. So there's some debate whether or not you'd want to initialize the variable or whether or not you're going to use a compose to handle the different information that comes back. I like to use variables when I'm teaching because it just makes a lot more sense to folks rather than using a compose action. So I'm using an initialize variable here. I'm calling it hub URL, and then I'm providing a type string because what's coming back is just a string. It's just text. So after I initialize my variable, which has to happen outside of any applies to each, it has to happen inside the top level because essentially it's acting as a global variable. But so I initialize my variable, and then I'm doing an apply to each. So for every value that comes back from the body of the parsejson, we are then going to set the variable of the hub URL here to the site URL. So what's going to happen is when we have a successful run here, you're just going to be able to page through the different variables to be able to see the URL that came back. So I'm going to go ahead and save this and we'll test it. Okay, praying to the demo gods that everything runs okay.
I was going to say.
I like to take chances, live dangerously.
There you go. There you go.
And you'll see, again, if you're not familiar with Power Automate, you'll see that basically the little green check mark means that it's worked, and that you know, every subsequent will check off as it runs successfully. Cool, so we're good to go. We can see that we've got output here. You know, we saw that in the last successful run. We can see that parsejson has happened, and we can see the output again here as well. That makes sense. And then in the apply to each, we know that we have 2 because that's what we've had here coming back. And in set variable, the first one, we've got our first hub URL, and then we can page through and see that we have a second hub URL here. So success, we're good to go. We have successfully set up our Azure Automation account. We've created a runbook, and then we've connected up to it using Power Automate. So like I said before, you know, in an end-to-end solution, what you're really going to be doing is pulling information from other sources. And that's, you know, for me, it's usually SharePoint. So pulling information in from a SharePoint list, putting in dynamic values as I need to inside of my PowerShell, and then creating jobs to do something else interesting. So you can imagine that at the end here, instead of just displaying information, maybe I'm emailing information to, you know, a specific person on a schedule so that they can see new users or new sites and things like that, whatever it is that they need to see. Or, you know, I'm also could be creating something such as actually creating a team, creating another site, or creating other values in a list. So that, you know, really the possibilities are endless here. It's just all you, whatever you can come up with to put inside your PowerShell and to take the manual steps out of things. So let's head back over to the slides. Basically, we're at cleanup here. So I did provide screenshots and step-by-steps for creating all of this here. So again, no worries if you did not take notes or if you missed something. I've got, you know, best practices on adding credentials and how to create your runbooks. So there are resources out there. There is also plenty of places where you can generate ideas about how to use this. So I'll provide this. There's documentation out there about tutorials for making runbooks. And then there's also an automation runbook gallery, which I think is really helpful. So I will add my runbook code to the end of this so that you can have sort of a template to start from. But there's lots of documentation out there. So that's it for me. There's my Twitter handle and then my blog as well. So if you guys have any questions, I'm here, but otherwise, thank you guys so much for having me. Appreciate it.